Alright, it's MOvember, day 11, and I'm going to do a big challenge today. I use Pia Mellody's Codependencey model. Anyone that's seen me work or lecture, I'm obsessed with it. It's a good foundation to understand life. She made it as a map for her to understand herself, and then she translated it to clients so they could use it. So I'm going to do my best to do this in 10 minutes. She says there's 5 things kids need to grow up to be fairly functional. And that firstly, they need to be valued, they need to be safe, they need to know about their reality, and they need to know that they're perfectly imperfect, they are dependent and need to get their needs met, needs and wants, and that they need and have the nature where they are open and spontaneous and they're in the moment. Now, what happens if they get those needs met by a parent who can meet those needs, then what happens is that they grow up age appropriately and have the ability to function, to live inside their own skin, for their nervous system to be able to respond to real threat, and that they can function in ways where they think clearly, assign congruent meaning, have the right amount of feeling matter to deal with, and make moderate and spontaneous choices. But when they experience trauma or neglect, stressed parenting, this interferes with that. So without going into depth and defining trauma, I'm going to just talk a little bit about what we see happens. And when she developed this model back in the 80s, it was what she experienced. Now neuroscience has come along and really fleshed this out, but I'll just give it to you in its simplest forms. She said that when those things don't get met, that we end up wounded. And she called this the wounded child. And she meant that as a wounded child state. When we don't get valued and we end up experiencing trauma, then about ourselves we can feel less than. When we grow up and our boundaries are violated, then essentially children will feel too vulnerable around our reality. Instead of growing up and learning we're perfectly imperfect, that we have an implicit sense that we're bad and flawed. That around dependency needs, having needs and wants not met and interfered with by trauma, that we simply end up too needy. Now when you are less than, too vulnerable, bad and flawed and too needy, life essentially inside and outside of us feels out of control. Now this is abhorrent for children. What neuroscience has come along and done has shown us that this idea of being less than isn't just a cognitive thought of I'm not okay, but it's the implicit felt sense that life's not going to work out for us. That this idea about being shame-based, that if we were traumatized under 5, the work of Dr. Alan Shaw shows us exactly what happens to the brain. So there's a lot more I'll share in the polyvagal theory coming up in the MOvember series. But essentially, this is an abhorrent way to live, that we can't survive that way. So what happens is that we learn and learn within the family to adapt. And she came up with this concept that there's the adapted adult child state. Now in this state, instead of feeling less than, we find and learn ways in the family to act better than. Some people grow up overindulged and we act better than you. But essentially, what I'm trying to do is present myself better than the less than I feel. When I feel too vulnerable, I try and act invulnerable, and essentially will put up walls. Some people, depending where they come from, put up walls of kindness, other people put up walls of rage, and everything in between. Instead of feeling bad and flawed, we will desperately try to be good or perfect. And if that doesn't work, what we can do is we can act as the rebel, like it doesn't matter, like we don't care. The subcultures, it's the James Dean idea of, well, you know, what are you rebelling against? Well, what do you got? And instead of feeling too needy, we start to act needless and wantless. Now, what's the goal of this in the minute? Well, the goal in the minute is to be in control, to try and desperately get back a sense that in the world, inside our own skin, we're okay. Now, these two things are extremes, and pendulizing between one and the other is exhausting. And essentially, we start to see the fabric of who someone is break down. And very early on, you'll see those organic cover-ups happen, suppression, repression, disassociation. We'll then see those family roles coming along, the hero, mascot, lost child, and scapegoat. We'll see more sophisticated adult adaptations of defense mechanisms and cognitive distortions. And then essentially behavioral cover-ups. But what they look like is what Pia Mellody said is the secondary symptoms. When you act less than and end up trying to act better than to cover up the less than, she came up with this idea that we will then have to negatively control others or allow ourselves to be negatively controlled. So I'm going to try to manipulate what you think and feel so you'll think a certain way, or I'll allow myself to be manipulated in a way to just keep myself safe. If I'm too vulnerable and I put up walls to act invulnerable, I will have to experience resentment. Now, when I experience resentment and it builds up, that will come out as rage. Either to someone else, I'll rage at you, or I'll internalize the rage and rage at myself. If I'm feeling bad and flawed, and let me remind you that neuroscientifically, the implicit memory of this, fundamentally there's something wrong. And we try desperately to cover that up and disguise it, that we are essentially in a spiritual crisis. And I'll do Bradshaw's recovery map in this series, and in this spiritual crisis, what we've got is that living inside my own skin, I am disconnected from myself due to the toxic shame at my core. And it's that disconnection from self that doesn't allow us into that intuitive spiritual part of us, the soul murder, as Bradshaw calls it. Too needy and needless and wantless, that dichotomy is experienced in addictions, that it's experienced in mental health issues. And as the Adverse Childhood Experience study showed us, it's definitely physical illness. Now, Pia was writing about physical illness being an expression of childhood trauma in the 80s. And so this idea that the body keeps the score, that Bessel van der Kolk is sort of certainly made famous with Peter Levine, the idea is that, Pia's been writing about this for a long time, that unmet needs, deprivation, lack of nurturing, abandonment leads to this idea that the physical symptoms will start to show up. Now, when we're out of control and trying to be in control, then we are going to experience ourselves and the world we're in intensity. Now, these are the secondary symptoms. Sometimes people come along and they say, I can't relate to that childhood stuff, I can't even remember it. But if you start to look at your adult life, you'll see the symptoms of negative control, resentment and rage, spiritual crisis, not knowing who you are, addictions, mental health issues, physical illness and intensity. Then you know that somewhere back there there's childhood trauma, I just haven't actually got hold of it yet. Now, if I bring your attention to this side of it, what happens then is there is no way I cannot have relational issues. As I then go out into the world as a relational being, I will see this get played out. Now, relationally, what happens is I will go to one up or one down when it comes to my experience of others. I'll feel less than you or better than you, and I will arrange myself that way. When there's too vulnerable, walls to cover it up, resentment and rage as a result, essentially I will either be enmeshed with you, or I will go into avoidance. Now, enmeshment can be positive and negative, and I'll talk more about that with love and avoidance addiction of Pia Mellody's model, but essentially in my relationship, I'm either positively engaged and enmeshed or negatively engaged and enmeshed, or I just can't be around you at all. This spiritual crisis is certainly spelt out relationally as dishonesty. That essentially I cannot tell you what's going on behind this wall. And most of the dishonesty in codependency and from developmentally traumatized people is that they just dishonest through omission. How are you today? I'm fine, thank you. You don't look fine. I'm a bit tired, I didn't sleep well. Generally, you can get rid of most people with that. If you're too needy, acting needless and wantless, and now you've got addictions, mental health and physical health issues happening, then generally we will have trouble with interdependence. We will be not able to be collaborative in relationships. We will either be anti-dependent or too dependent and living in those extremes. So in a relationship, being collaborative, being able to negotiate our needs just doesn't happen. And essentially, of course, then we have intimacy issues. Meaning that in regards to how Pia puts that, the idea of in regards to my body, in regards to my thinking, in regards to how I feel, in regards to what I do, I don't live well inside of that. I can't interpret the data. I can't be around you as you do it, and I don't filter with internal and external boundaries well, which I'll probably do in another post. Now, essentially, what's really hard about this is most people that have been developmentally traumatized will find themselves in this state. And this is one way to sort of work out, how does my complex post-traumatic stress happen? Well, they'll usually find it here. And if you really can't work out that early childhood stuff, what we're looking for is most people can see where they're carrying resentment or where their rage at self or others comes out. We identify those. But what happens from this is Pia says, well, essentially though, the way out is I need to create a functional adult. The hardest thing is no one's coming. No one's coming to get us. That's the hard thing. We have to grieve what happened to us, and we have to grieve what we've done to others as a result of it, and we have to grieve now what we didn't get. But essentially, is that we have to go back, and this is what a child needed, and this is what we need to do in reparenting, is that we have to learn to self-esteem. It's not going to come from anyone else. I need to learn healthy boundaries, internal, external and sexual. I have to learn about my reality and how to interpret that data and from that meet my needs and wants appropriately. Now this means I can certainly get surrogate spouses and friends, but it's a negotiated arrangement, like with a sponsor or peers and mentors in recovery, therapists, etc. A family of choice. And then, of course, the thing that I think is special about this is the last thing happens is that eventually, if we can do this, life once again becomes spontaneous and we again become open. Now, what's interesting about that is that's the nature of a child, is that I can live in the moment, that I've dealt with some of the shame, and I can just be here with you the way I am, knowing that I'm responsible for my internal world. I have to manage a wounded part of me, and I've got to contain an adapted part of me. That's my inheritance. And for me to move forward in recovery, I need to manage that relationship and become aware and turn up to it. If I do that, it opens me back up. And then I'm back out of that sort of soul murder into a resurrection. Then I can have a relationship with a power greater than me. And in that, it opens me up to all those wonders of the universe again. I hope this has been helpful. Good luck, and remember, please donate to MOvember. Thank you.